All right, here we are, Kinesiology 230. This is chapter 23. Still talking about resistance training and program design for clients who are athletes. This is kind of a sidebar, a lot like the one we just did for soccer programming. This will be some just basic program design ideas. This is more about just like conceptually understanding and kind of visualizing patterns and how to lay out programs. This is not by any means exhaustive and by not any means the only way to do it, but it's more in terms of just trying to have you have a better understanding of the different parts. Now we talked about microcycle, mesocycle, and macrocycle. If we look at the granular view, like if somebody says to you, man, I'm really stoked about I'm going to hit the gym and pound out a chest workout, that's going to be that day. That's going to be a microcycle. And we talked a little bit before in terms about manipulating programs through rep and set combinations, but also from exercise or through exercise selection. So if we have like a big old chest Monday here, which everybody does chest on Monday, we have a big bench press day on Monday, and then you come back on a Thursday and you do dumbbell bench press, you're creating variety within the program itself. And I highly advise this as just a basic kind of programming premise to mix and match some of your exercises just for variety's sake. But going back to what a microcycle is, it's a week view. The book notes it could be a week view or two, but you look at it in terms of just a smaller kind of view. And you saw some of the undulating program in the previous presentation where they talked about how to manipulate the rep and set schemes. So just kind of think of those things as we just talk of this in terms of context on a calendar. So this is about a mesocycle. Mesocycle is in general 2 weeks up to several months. And you look at this in terms of, we talked about general to specific, simple to complex, and we talked about specificity and training. When you're further out, like we saw in that soccer example on the calendar, when you saw those red weeks, and those were the hypertrophy phases, the specificity in training is, relatively speaking, not very high. There might be some specificity, maybe some running technique stuff. There might be some work that you do specific for the sport. But as you go from hypertrophy to base strength to power to peaking, what ends up happening is you're going from general to specific while you're going through your programming. So realize as a coach or when you're working with your clients, as you're working closer and closer towards a goal date or a goal event or the actual in-season mesocycle, you have to go from higher volume in general to lower volume, from lower intensity to higher intensity. Those are two main manipulation or variables you can manipulate. But you're also going from a generalized trained environment to a more specific training environment. And I can't stress this enough. You look at in terms of programming, that is a way you as a coach or a trainer can kind of drive programming to elicit the training response that you want. So just keep this in mind when we're talking about applying a training stimulus to elicit a training response. You're trying to do that in the context of several weeks, perhaps several months when you're working with a client or an athlete. And so you have to be able to figure out how to do that, but you also have to figure out how to kind of keep things fresh and interesting for your clients. These will be some of the more simpler things you can do with a client in a generalized fitness environment. If we look at this, these are 2 different months that we're comparing. One could be January, one could be February. But if we look at this, for example, we have Monday, Wednesday, Friday in red. Here we have Tuesday, Thursday in red. One of the simplest and easiest things you can do with a client is they want to work out with you 2 days a week. So they're going to work out with you Tuesdays and Thursdays. So they're doing weights on Tuesday and Thursday. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they need to do cardio. Perhaps they're a big runner, right? Or they do other sports and they want to focus on their sports more. Well, then they do during the off season, they might have 2 days a week, or during the early preseason, they might have 2 days a week that are sport specific, denoted in blue. But when they get closer and closer to their actual in-season mesocycle, then they become more sport specific on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So they add another day that's specific in training. So you can kind of play around with this in terms of what modality you want. It could be strength training on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then when the person wants to pick up running more in the next month, then it becomes strength training on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Then they do running on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It just depends. It depends on the person who's in front of you. But my point is, if you look at this just in terms of like almost odd, even, odd, even, odd, even, you can find ways to manipulate just even that in the simplest of ways. We talked a little bit about just linear programming. This would be a pretty overly simplified version of this over an 8-week mesocycle, where during the first week you do 3 sets of 20, 3 sets of 15, 3 sets of 12, 3 sets of 10. This is on all exercises across the board. Then in the next month you go 3 by 10, 3 by 8, 3 by 6, 3 by 15. But of course, while also raising the intensity because you're lowering the volume, right? The color codification on this would be, if we just do it alphabetically for the fun of it, arms, back, chest, legs, shoulders. You don't have to do your splits that way, but it's just a real simple alphabetical way to look at broad body parts. And so over the course of, and I've done this program, please, and I've actually enjoyed it a lot because it was something that was completely different than what I've ever done before. I had arms on Monday, back on Tuesday, chest on Wednesday, legs, shoulders, and I would do some ancillary stuff like calves on alternate days or forearms on alternate days. So I'd have 2 body parts, or I would have a heart or ab day or core day versus another day. But in the context of just having arms, back, chest, shoulders, legs, or chest, legs, shoulders, if I can do it alphabetically, I was manipulating the overall volume and the overall load during that time. So over the course of 8 weeks, I was dropping the volume from 3 sets of 20, which is 60 repetitions for each exercise, down to 3 sets of 5, which is 15. Right? So it's a quarter of the volume. So my point to you is this is yet another way you can just kind of look at programming and manipulate now, in this case, a couple different variables, right? In terms of the programming for body parts that you're going to work on particular days in terms of your splits, but also how you're going to break out your rep and set combinations. When we talk about an undulating program, if we keep the same concept here of alphabetical arms, back, chest, legs, shoulders, we'll keep that just consistent for this example. In week 1, you do 3 sets of 20. In week 3, you do 3 sets of 15. So in week 5, it's 3 sets of 12, then 3 sets of 10. So on weeks 1, 3, 5, and 7, we did the higher volume work. And then on weeks 2, 4, 6, and 8, we did the lower volume work. So what you have is high volume, lower volume, high volume, lower volume, in the context of overall having a decreasing volume environment with an increased intensity environment. And you're doing so by undulating back and forth from week to week to week to week over the course of 8 weeks. And I've done this one as well, and I really enjoyed the heck out of this one because it broke up the monotony of this, where it's very high volume on one end and low volume on the other, because I had this undulating format from week to week to week that you see here. Again, just a different way to do it. So here you are, you have a 6-month mesocycle, you're looking at this and you go, okay, take those couple concepts that we just threw at you on a few slides here, and you go, all right, well, I'm going to have weights on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'm going to do cardio on these days. And then the next month, I'm going to do cardio on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and weights on Tuesday, Thursday. Then when I go into my next month after that, I'm going to do the more linear progression where I go 20, 15, 12, 10, 10, 8, 6, 5. And then I bring myself out. Now, real quick, if we think of this back in terms of hypertrophy, base strength, strength, power, very hypertrophy oriented. Matter of fact, this whole month is pretty much hypertrophy. But in terms of the book, they would classify hypertrophy up here in a 20 to 15. But I would look at it and go, this is very hypertrophy. We get base strength here. Then you got strength, kind of power up in this range. You're kind of on the cusp of power at that point. You're not really even getting into peaking. Down here, you have that undulating format that we just talked about, where it's high volume, lower volume, high volume, lower volume, high volume, lower volume, undulating in an overall environment where we're dropping the volume and increasing the intensity. So just like if you lay this out in front of your client and maybe not even tell them about it, but just in your own headspace, you have a book of 20 clients and you have several of them who kind of fit these formats and things that you can do with them. Next thing you know, you have 5 clients maybe in your book of business who might be working through this particular program. Perhaps you have 4 or 5 other clients who are working through this particular program, and you might have 4 or 5 other clients who are different in terms of their training needs, but they do fit the basic criteria for this type of program, and they're in this format up here. So my point to you is now what you can do as a trainer, and this is one of the things I've done as a trainer throughout my career, as I took some of these very basic concepts from periodization and program design, and I overlaid them into a personal training environment where it allowed me to work with my entire book of business, all my clients, in a way where I could have different mesocycles throughout the year, from January to spring break to perhaps Memorial Day to 4th of July, 4th of July to kids back to school. You can start to put together like these different cycles. Kids are going back to school, schedules change, but also the weather's changing, so people are being driven more inside as opposed to running outside, so you can change your programming to adapt to meet those needs. So my point to you is this: if you have a couple of these real simple periodization and program design things like kind of in your hip pocket ready to go, when you bring clients into the fold and you start working with them, you can manipulate these rep and set combinations, and your clients will never be the wiser, and their bodies will never be the wiser, more importantly, and they'll have a constant adaptation environment because you have a constantly changing or variable training stimulus environment, right? So just kind of wrap yourself around your arms around these, give them a big hug, and just kind of use them going forward. And it gets back into these in terms of periodization. We're talking about cycles and phases. And I talked a little bit about variation and exercise selection from week to week to week and even day to day to day. And then within the cycles and phases, you're looking at these different month to month categories of undulating the rep and set combinations to be able to get a training response. So, periodization could take on several different forms. And my point to you is, as a trainer or a coach, if you have a strategy or a plan to create these on the front end, and you have basically an overall environment where you want to work with your athletes or work with your clients, you can then, I'm not going to say it's easy and plug and play, but I'm telling you, if you have that strategy in place, it's a lot easier to manage maybe 25, 30 clients and be able to understand what you want to do with different people during different times of the year. Just saying. All right, guys, I'm going to sign off from this and move to the next presentation. Thanks.